Hi, everyone. My name is Gia Pace. I'm the Public Programs Coordinator here at the Museum of Jewish Heritage, a living memorial to the Holocaust. And we have a very special program for you today. Most of you will have seen the movie, The Garden of the Finzi-Continis, and we're going to have a panel discussion based on that. And if you haven't seen the movie yet, you still will be able to see the movie after the panel today. So without further ado, I want to introduce Jacqueline Reich. She is the Professor of Communication and Media Studies at Fordham University. She is the author of the Meschede Films of Italian Silent Cinema, Beyond the Latin Lover, Marcello Mastroianni, Masculinity and the Italian Cinema. She is co-author with Catherine O'Raw of DV, and co-editor with Piero Garofalo of Reviewing Fascism, Italian Cinema, 1922 to 1943. She has also written widely on Italian-American cinema and culture and is co-director with Dr. Kathleen LaPenta of the Bronx Italian-American History Initiative, a community-engaged oral history research project at Fordham. So Jackie, welcome, and I'll hand over the program to you now, and she will introduce you to our other guests.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining us. I'm going to introduce our panelists and then give a brief introduction to the film. And then I will we'll begin our question and answer period. So I'll start in this, I'm going in alphabetical order. The first panelist is Ricky Ian Gordon, who is a highly prolific composer of art songs, opera, and theater, and of works too numerous to name. His songs have been performed and were recorded by such internationally renowned singers as Renee Fleming, Judy Collins, Kelly O'Hara, Audra McDonald, Kristen Chenoweth, and Andrea Marcovici. We're very excited that he has written an opera based on Giorgio Bassani's novel and film, The Garden of the Finzi-Continis, with librettist Michael Corey for the New York City Opera and the National Yiddish Theater Volksbühne. Francesco Pitassio is professor of film studies at the Università degli Studi di Udine, where he acts as research coordinator for the Department of Humanities and Cultural Heritage. He has published widely on film acting and stardom, Italian film history and culture, documentary cinema, and Central Eastern European cinema. He is the author, most recently, of Neorealist Film Culture, 1945 to 1954, Rome Open Cinema, published in 2019. He is also the principal investigator of the European Union HERA-funded project, Visual Culture of Trauma, Obliteration, and Reconstruction in Post-World War II Europe, 2019 to 2022, a collaborative research project with German, Italian, Czech, and French universities and cultural institutions. Portia Prebys is one of the founders and current president of the Association of American Colleges and University Programs in Italy. She received her PhD from the University of Sassari, where she also taught for many years. She has published widely on the works of Giorgio Bassani, her companion as well. In 2016, she founded and since then curates the Centro Studi Bassaniani in the city of Ferrara. She has been awarded the Cavaliere dell'Ordine al Merito della Repubblica Italiana, among many other honors. And last but not least, Stanislao Pugliese is Professor of European History and the Queensboro UNICO Distinguished Professor of Italian American Studies at Hofstra University. A specialist on modern Italy, the anti-fascist resistance, and Italian Jews, he is the author, editor, and translator of 15 books, including Bitter Spring, A Life of Ignazio Silone. He is the editor of The Legacy of Primo Levi and Answering Auschwitz, Primo Levi's Science and Humanism. So today we're going to talk about The Garden of Finzi-Contini, and it is based on the novel of the same name by Giorgio Bassani, which was published in 1962 and made into the film by Vittorio De Sica in 1970. The film went on to win the Best Oscar for Foreign Film in 1972. The film tells the story of the young Jewish residents of Ferrara in the late 1930s and early 1940s as Italy deepened its persecution of the country's Jewish population. Today, I'm going to direct questions to our four panelists to help us contextualize and understand the film from historical, cinematic, artistic, and personal points of view. So I'm going to start with Stan, and we're all on a first name basis here. I'm going to start with Stan for some historical background. So Stan, can you give us some historical background on the Holocaust in Italy, and in particular, the history of the Jews in Ferrara?
Yes, thank you, Jackie. And thank you, Gia and the museum for inviting us and putting together this really extraordinary panel. The history of the Jews in Italy is really something extraordinary. More than 2,000 years of history. And the history of Jews in the city of Ferrara sort of mirrors the ebb and flow of the history of the Jews on the Italian peninsula. And if I could borrow a phrase from the writer Alexander Stile, whose book, Benevolence and Betrayal, 5 Jewish Italian Families Under Fascism, was one of the works, in the last generation that really stimulated an interest in the history of Italian Judaism. This idea of a pendulum swinging back and forth between benevolence and betrayal, I think, is very, very revealing. Also because, it oftentimes depended on who was the emperor at the time, who was the pope at the time, who was in power at the time. For example, the Medici family in Florence, or in the case of Ferrara, the Este family, who actually invited Jews into the city of Ferrara, who Jacob Burckhardt, the great Renaissance scholar, called the first modern city. But I was thinking about this recently, that the title of Stile's book, it includes embedded within a kind of critique, benevolence and betrayal. Benevolence, which we think of as positive, has a kind of dark shadow, in the sense that benevolence is bestowed, in this case on the Jews. But benevolence that can be bestowed can also be withdrawn, right? And this, unfortunately, tragically, was the situation of the Jews in Italy for 2,000 years. In Ferrara, you might know that the synagogue was established in the early 15th century. About 100 years later, Ferrara was subject to this new institution created by the papacy, the ghetto. The ghetto was not created to separate the Jews from Christians. It actually, in Christian theology, was created to expedite the conversion of Jews to Christianity, thereby expediting the second coming of the Messiah. I think it's a kind of, misunderstanding of the ghetto and its kind of theological ramifications. It's very important to understand this. But be that as it may, even under the conditions of the ghetto, the Jews of Ferrara and the Jews of other cities like Venice and Milan, they were instrumental in that historical movement that we call the Renaissance. The Renaissance, as we know it, could not have existed without the work of Jewish scholars and especially Jewish publishers, Jewish publishing families in Ferrara and other places, very important. By the time you get into the modern age and the time that Napoleon's armies come into the Italian peninsula and literally tear down the gates of the ghettos, at least in northern Italy. The gates of the ghetto in Rome were going to last until 1870. Jews are permitted in many places to participate fully in the cultural, the political life of the country. By the time you get to the turn of the 20th century, or even in the 19th century, Italian Jews are participating in the movement for unification, the Risorgimento. And oftentimes Italian Jews saw their own personal emancipation as tied to the emancipation of Italy, the unification of Italy, which was very important. And they were very proud of the fact that they distinguished themselves as, proud Italian patriots, even nationalists, if you will. By the time you get to the 20th century, Italian Jews had assimilated so much that there was concern in the Italian Jewish communities, especially the most conservative community in Rome, that perhaps Italian Jews were assimilating too much. By 1900, fully 50% of marriages were interreligious marriages. Jews had, assimilated into the middle class. You had 2 Italian prime ministers who had a Jewish background. In 1904, when the great synagogue in Rome was consecrated, the mayor of Rome was Ernesto Natan, the seat of Roman Catholicism. The mayor was Jewish and nobody batted an eye. When fascism came to power in 1922, fascism that initially at least did not, have an anti-Semitic platform, and Italian Jews were just as attracted to fascism as anybody else. not because they were Jewish, but because they had assimilated into the middle class. And they, bought into Mussolini's rhetoric that, only I can save Italy from communism. And you see this in Bassani, you see this in Italian literature throughout. Italian Jews like Aldo Finzi and others were high-ranking members of the fascist party. That began to change in the early 1930s. And although the traditional interpretation was that, the fascist regime embraced anti-Semitism because of pressure from Adolf Hitler, today most historians have rejected that thesis, and I've come to a kind of more nuanced and complicated, complex understanding of anti-Semitism in fascist Italy, that it was there all along, but Mussolini, for whatever reason, had kept the anti-Semites on the short leash. But as early as 1933, you have the first Italian translation of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, and the writing was on the wall. It is true that until the Nazis occupied Italy in the fall of 1943, not one Jew was deported to the extermination camps. And because we have something like National Socialism and Hitler in Germany, the Italians sort of in the 20th century, they get off the hook. And there develops this mythology of the 20th century of Italiani brava gente. The Italians are good people. They never succumb to totalitarianism or anti-Semitism like the Germans, but that's not true, as you see in Bassani.
Thank you, Stan. Moving on to Portia. Portia, can you tell us a little bit about Bassani's life in Ferrara, his hometown? What were his experiences during the war, and what inspired him to write the novel? Portia, you need to unmute yourself.
Sure. Okay, sorry. Bassani is, of course, always identified with Ferrara, and will go down in history as being the writer from Ferrara. But it just so happened that he was born in Bologna by sheer chance. His father was a medical officer in the army, like all good Italians, Jews included, in 1916. Everybody was in the army. So his mother went for the day to Bologna to visit her husband, and Giorgio was born there. Giorgio's father was a doctor. His name was Angelo Enrico. And his grandfather on his mother's side was also a very important doctor. He'd been in charge of the public hospital in Ferrara for more than 40 years. And his name was Minervi, a very common Jewish name, Cesare Minervi. So we're talking about people from Ferrara for many, many generations, but it just so happens that Giorgio was born by chance in Bologna. Giorgio had a brother named Paolo, 4 years younger, who was an engineer who, because of the racial laws, had to study in France, as the film does indicate. And he readily became a partisan. He worked for the Italian partigiani in France and in Spain, and then came back and was famous for building radios in the war and doing a lot of bombing along the Po. Giorgio also had a sister who was 8 years younger than he. Her name was Jenny Liscia. And when the family had to go into hiding in Florence, why, she was an adolescent and, of course, grew up there. Giorgio spent a very common life in Ferrara, a typical life. He went to the Liceo. He was a great athlete. He played calcio and went swimming, and was very involved in sports of all sorts. Frankly, he wanted to be a pianist. He was a great concert pianist. And at age 17, however, he decided, well, maybe I should find something a little bit more practical. And at 17, he decided to go into literature instead. So he, in 1934, enrolled in the Facoltà di Lettere, in the humanistic studies area at the University of Bologna. His classmates were rather famous people. Attilio Bertolucci was one of his closest classmates, Bernardo Bertolucci's father. Riccardo Bacchelli was in his class, Leo Longanesi, Giuseppe Raimondi, and the most important thing that happened in 1934 is that Giorgio discovered Giorgio Morandi, and they became friends, and he was a lifelong lover of Morandi's work. Okay, his first publication took place in the Corriere Padano in 1935, and he wasn't even 20. He continued to publish, and in 1939, he was able, despite the racial laws, to graduate with Carlo Calcaterra. He did a thesis on Tommaseo, and he immediately began to teach in the Jewish school that had been set aside for Jews because of the racial laws in Ferrara. And this he did until September of 1943. September of 1943, he decided he would move on, that they had to go into hiding, and that it was not safe any longer to stay in Ferrara. By this time, he had false documents. His name was Bruno Ruffo, and of course, because of the geographical situation, he came from the south of Italy. Nobody could check because the Americans by this time had landed in Anzio. And so anybody with false papers, of course, had birthplaces and residences in the south of Italy, which couldn't be checked upon. While he was in Florence looking for a place for his parents to live, he wasn't able to work. His parents came at the end of November of 1943, and Giorgio left Florence on December the 6th, 43, and moved to Rome, where he lived the rest of his life permanently. Okay. When the war ended, was able to find a job teaching in the government schools where he taught for 35 years then, high school, and also at the School for Dramatic Arts in Rome. He continued to work on his literature. He, by this time, had a wife and 2 small children, so he made ends meet by writing movie scripts, of which he wrote about 15. And this is how he made a living and kept going. He also worked for Feltrinelli from 1956 until 1963. So he was tough. It was tough for him to make ends meet until, of course, he published in February of 62, The Garden of the Finzi-Continis. Well, that changed his life very much so. And it was smooth running after that. The book was a huge success. And he did continue teaching until, so he would have a pension, and but he could dedicate his time in the afternoons to writing, which he did, and also played tennis. He played tennis with Antonioni, another native of Ferrara. Giorgio started playing tennis at the age of 10, and played until he was 83, a year before he died at 84. So I think that gives you a little bit of background. Does that answer?
That's great.
Your
Thank you
questions?
so
Okay.
much.
No,
Thank
thank
you
you.
so much. All right, Francesco, you're up. Can you give us a little bit of cinematic context? How does the film sort of fit into what was going on in Italian cinema in the 1970s, and also within the context of Vittorio De Sica's work? And I'm very excited, you as a specialist in neorealist, I think neorealism, you can give us quite an interesting perspective on this.
Thank you, Jackie, for the question. Well, I'll try to be as synthetic as possible, given the fact that the 1960s, and I consider The Garden of the Finzi-Continis as really a sort of transitional film between the 1960s and the 1970s, is possibly the richest era in the history of Italian cinema. It is the epoch during which the generation of neorealist filmmakers as De Sica was, or Luchino Visconti, or Roberto Rossellini is still very productive. But at the same time, also the generation of those who came right after, the most renowned authors of Italian cinema, such as Michelangelo Antonioni, who Portia just mentioned, or Federico Fellini, who got started as screenplay writers in the 1940s, but then moved to directing movies in the 1950s. And at the same time, it's the epoch during which the comedy Italian style knew its heyday, and the new generation of new wave filmmakers such as Bernardo Bertolucci and Marco Bellocchio got started. So it is an incredibly...
Francesco, could you just speak up a little bit, just so
Sure.
that people can hear you? Thank you so much.
It is an incredibly rich period, and I think that the Garden of Finzi-Continis somehow entails this incredibly richness. At the same time, the 1960s is also a period during which the say myth of Italian resistance and somehow the purity of the nation, which rebutted the fascist experience between 1943 and 1945, was hugely countered and questioned. And it was questioned also through cinema. Think about of the adaptation of Giorgio Bassani's The Long Night of 1943, which was produced in the early 1960s, or Shoot the Pigeon by Giuliano Montaldo, or also the new generation, such as Bernardo Bertolucci, whose third film, the Stratagem of the Spider, or the Spider Stratagem, questions deeply and harshly the myth of resistance as a myth in itself. So I think that this also happened as somehow overlapped the countering of the myth of resistance and Italian purity, and a deep exploration of what the fascist experience was, as in a film such as Il Conformista, The Conformist, which was an adaptation of Alberto Moravia, and which was produced also in 1970 as The Garden of Finzi-Continis and directed by Bernardo Bertolucci. And last but not least, this reflection on what fascist experience was had to do also with what the cooperation between the bourgeoisie and fascism in itself, which is also something which is somehow in the backdrop of the Garden of Finzi-Continis. Think, for instance, of the figure of Giorgio's father, who's a middle class, as Stanislao was pointing out in his communication, and at the same time he's a fervent fascist at the beginning of the film. So De Sica at the time was somehow at the sunset of his career, but still he just he won an Oscar in 1965 for Yesterday, Today, and Tomorrow. And he was also a very, I would say, it was a safe filmmaker. He was very skilled in directing huge co-production schemes, and most of his productions in the 1960s are co-production schemes under the guidance of Carlo Ponti, the renowned Italian producer. Just to make some examples, The Condemned of Altona, Yesterday, Today, and Tomorrow, or Marriage Italian Style, or the film which he produced just before the Garden of Finzi-Continis, which was Sunflower, which was an incredibly somehow daring co-production between France, Italy, and the USSR, which was somehow hindered by the KGB at some point for obviously ideological questions, but which was also, I would say, an exception for De Sica, for the difficulties that the film encountered. So when Vittorio De Sica directs The Garden of Finzi-Continis, is definitely a figure who somehow secures the outcomes, and is a very reliable filmmaker. He got Oscars, Academy Awards, or Davide Donatello, the Italian Award, or BAFTA or Golden Globes. So he's possibly the most, or is considered by the producer, Gianni Lucari, who is a very interesting figure, as a very reliable person to appoint for directing the movie.
Thanks so much. And we're going to hear a little bit about what Bassani thought about that, about the film after we hear from Ricky Ian Gordon, who's going to talk about his opera and what inspired you to write the opera and how much did you base it on the film, on the novel? And maybe you can play us a brief selection.
Okay. Thank you, Jackie. It's great to be here with you all. The reason I wanted to make an opera out of Gordon the Finzi-Continis is Michael Corey and I, who wrote the libretto to the opera, had just finished doing a big opera of The Grapes of Wrath, the Steinbeck novel. And we were looking for our next project. And I wasn't even thinking about, one night I was walking down 72nd Street on the Upper West Side of Manhattan, and I thought my partner, Kevin, I was thinking, I wonder if Kevin's ever seen Garden of the Finzi-Continis. And so I went to the video store and got the film and took it home to show Kevin. And when it was over, I was inconsolable. I was slaughtered by it. And I'd seen it, I saw it when I was 15, and I saw it like every 5 years. I would watch this movie, but it never hit me that way. And I realized this has to be my next project. I called Michael Corey, and the thing is, it is we based it on the book for a couple of reasons. First of all, just in terms of getting the rights to a book or getting the rights to a movie, but also the movie is very quiet. The movie is very imagistic, and you know, the people in the book talk more, and so I would say that is the main reason. And I loved the book. You know, I loved the book, and I love the movie. I wish I could read Bassani's article about why he didn't like the movie, although I have to say I think it's a stunning movie. So that's the reason I wanted to make it into an opera. Michael Corey came aboard, and it took us a long time. We were supposed to write it for Minnesota Opera, but it wasn't ready. It took years because it was a hard piece to musicalize. I was in Italy at Civitella Ranieri, which is like a castle for artists, and then I went to Ferrara, and it just was. Anyway, I'm excited about it. Do you want to hear a little thing from it? All right. So I hope this sounds okay, guys. I mean, Zoom is horrible for sound, but I just thought I'll play you like it's less than a minute. I think it's one of the it's the main theme on which everything is based. So it's short. So if it sounds terrible, at least it won't be long. Okay. That's just a little.
Thank you so much. I can't wait to see it live and in person. I think we all long for those days. Okay, I'm going to go back. I think we seem to have lost Portia. I'm hoping that she'll come back and join us. This Zoom is always an adventure these days. I'm going to go back to Francesco and ask about casting. Some of the choices in casting might seem a little bit unusual. In particularly Dominique Sanda as a French actress, and Helmut for the role of Nicole, and Helmut Berger, an Austrian actor, for the role of Alberto. Do you know how and why they were chosen?
Actually, I believe that the choice of the casting of the actors, so such an international cast, was conceived of as a way to appeal to an international audience. Dominique Sanda just came out from a highly passed auteur film as Un Femme Douce by Robert Person, and she was also casted in The Conformist by Bernardo Bertolucci. And basically, all her career in the 1970s was marked by this kind of international author cinema. And the same was with Helmut Berger. Helmut Berger just worked in The Damned by Luchino Visconti, where he portrayed this kind of bourgeois figure of decadence as he portrays in The Garden of Finzi-Continis, possibly even accentuating this dimension, which was pristinely in the work of Giorgio Bassani in the novel. So he also accentuates this homoerotic stress on the character. Another choice, which is quite revealing in my view, is that of Fabio Testi as the friend of Alberto, the communist friend of Alberto Melnate, who he was a very Italian type star, was most renowned for working in spaghetti westerns. He was in Once Upon a Time in America by Sergio Leone, or working this kind of poliziotteschi, this cheap police movies, which were the backbone of popular cinema in the 1970s Italy. And he's chosen to act as the non-Jewish Italian committed character. So it was, in my view, an interesting choice. And in the very end, Romolo Valli, as the father, was a very established both cinema and theater player. So more or less, this is, in my view, it was a way to somehow produce a varied cast to appeal to different audiences.
Thank you so much. I'm not sure, there's Portia, wonderful. Welcome back, Portia. We have certainly, all people are wondering, I'm sure, how did Bassani react to the film?
Well, later on in life, Giorgio didn't want to go to the movies at all because he'd spent so much time writing movie scripts that he kind of had a reaction against going to the movies. So to get Giorgio to accompany to go to movies was an almost impossible undertaking. If I insisted a great deal to see a film that everyone was talking about, well, perhaps he would bear with me in the end. But we would go to the theater in the late afternoon. We would always sit in the first 3 rows up front. And after a couple of minutes, but I underline exactly after about 2 minutes from the beginning of the film, he would pull out his pocket watch to check the time. He never wore a wristwatch. If it were very dark inside the movie theater, well, he would light up his Bic lighter for cigars to help him see the time better. He would grumble, too many close-ups. He would again look at his watch, and then within 5 minutes, we would have to leave with no comment whatsoever. He could never imagine in his whole lifetime ever watching film on the television, okay? As we said before, Bassani had collaborated on the drawing up of about 1,000 film scripts. And for a total of about 1,000 pages. He was considered a genius for dialogue in the Roman world of cinema. He declared, and I quote, "I do not remember any one of those pages, and not because I'd written them without commitment, hope you'll believe me, but for the simple reason that they did not have any deliberate, minimal, autonomous value," unquote. He used to admit, however, that the work of scriptwriter was useful for his literary literature, that the experience forced him absolutely to get out of his shell, to express himself completely on the page. He affirmed, and again I quote, "Writing for the cinema, doing a job so different from that of a writer, I realized fundamentally that the writer, to express himself, had no other means at his disposal than the word and punctuation, nothing else," unquote. One could never mention the name of Vittorio De Sica in Giorgio's presence. If by chance someone spoke about him on television even, Giorgio would shut off the set and leave the room. You'll remember that the novel was published in February of 1962 and was presented for the first time in Ferrara. Well, already in 1963, Bassani had sold the rights for the film for the highest sum ever paid in Italy in that period to a writer for rights to a literary work. He immediately agreed to assist with the drawing up of the film script with Vittorio Bonicelli for Valerio Zurlini's Documento Film Company. However, early on, Bassani, after years of incomprehension and misunderstandings, realized that the Documento Film Company had no intention whatsoever of respecting his vision and his contributions, and he requested that his name be removed from the project. Above all, this happened when Vittorio De Sica was called in 1970 to resolve the question once and for all, with yet a fourth film script. The two had known each other for some time, but Bassani detested De Sica personally for his lifestyle and his politics. Older by a generation and with a much more extroverted temperament than the reservedness always exhibited by Bassani, the 70-year-old personified absolute superficiality for Giorgio, and with an addition, an extremely vulgar taste for melodrama, according to him. They would meet socially in the 60s at Carlo Ponti's and Sophia Loren's Villa Sara in Marino, where De Sica felt at home. Often accompanied by his friend Mario Soldati, Bassani appreciated the vast art collection located in Sophia Loren's villa, 156 first-class quality paintings, including a few by Francis Bacon, whom Bassani adored. Bassani viewed the film in its entirety for the first time in November of 1970, along with the judge, after he took the producers to court to have his name removed from the film. He didn't want money. He wanted to save his name. The film was shown in preview on December 2nd, 1970 in Jerusalem in Hebrew, in the presence of the Prime Minister Golda Meir, who was seated next to Vittorio De Sica. Well, the Israeli press reaction was emotional and sentimental, and 2 days later, the film came out in Italy. Few people know that after a few days, Bassani published a kind of apologia in the Espresso on December the 6th, 1970, in which he objected to the extreme liberties with which his characters were treated. Above all, the portrait of his father has already been indicated, whose destiny in a concentration camp contrasts totally with his destiny described in the novel. There is no room for misunderstanding the pungent and bitter tone of the article entitled "The Garden Betrayed, Il Giardino Tradito," in defense of himself. Bassani had received a serious and moral and spiritual wrong. In fact, today, every showing of the film worldwide still carries as a subtitle to the film the phrase "freely taken" from the novel by Giorgio Bassani. Bassani won, but it was of little importance at that point. In Paris, the film came out on December the 8th, in New York on December the 16th of 1971 at the Plaza. Every newspaper article in all languages spoke exclusively about De Sica. In 1972, he won the Oscar for the best foreign film. The two producers carried home the Oscar. As a matter of fact, a couple of weeks ago, I happened to meet up with Vittorio De Sica's daughter, Amy De Sica, and she mentioned that her father never ever saw the Oscar, which I think is kind of interesting. The producers kept it. Bassani never gave up, however, demonstrating his intellectual indignation about the matter. He said, and again I quote, "A script writer doesn't express himself in a script. He's not a creator. A director expresses himself when he creates visually. I knew all this when I sold the rights to my book. I sold them without reserves. The objections I made afterwards were not of an aesthetical kind, but of a moral kind. Because they charged me as a private citizen with a story that is not mine, as a scriptwriter, I cannot sign it. In fact, as it came out, I did not write the script," unquote. He always underlined the fact that the film and not the book speaks about him in the first person. And again, I quote, "You see, the film instead of the book is about me. The character's name is Giorgio. The scenes in the house were shot in my own house in Ferrara, a house which was my great-grandfather's and my grandfather's, and now is mine. In the book, on the contrary, that I is used in its lyrical translation, in its absolute value, the way Marcel Proust uses it."
I'm sorry, Portia, we're going to have to move on to the next question. Can you just wrap that up quickly,
Well,
please?
Nicole never existed. The garden itself did not exist. And the final tort was that in the film, Giorgio says his father dies in Buchenwald, but his father didn't die in Buchenwald. He died in his own bed. So Giorgio couldn't sign a script that was so faulty as far as the truth was concerned.
Thank you. That's incredibly fascinating. I'm going to turn, first of all, I just want to remind people, I know we're going to move to the question and answer period. Please put your questions in the Q&A feature at the bottom of the screen, not the chat feature. That will help us moderate the questions. And Stan, I'm going to ask you a question sort of about teaching and a little bit about films about the Holocaust. Oftentimes films are shown in history curricula regarding the Holocaust to help visualize the experience. What do you think this film brings to the table that others don't?
It's a very difficult question. I'm teaching a course right now on historiography of the Holocaust. And one of the questions that I've asked my students is there a particular medium which allows us to get closer to the truth of the Holocaust? You know, might it be memoirs? Might it be poetry? Might it be film? Coming from a very visual culture, my students always say film. And in fact, on Monday, we're going to watch, you know, Alain Resnais's Night in Fog, you know, and preparing them for that. I wouldn't show The Garden of the Finzi-Continis in a course on the Holocaust because it's an elliptical film, right? And in a way, it's almost too subtle for undergraduate students to understand really the horror that's involved in here, because you don't have images of the concentration camps or the barbed wires or the gas chambers, right? And, you know, I was thinking about this, how incredibly beautiful and subtle, you know, the novel is, and that, you know, having read Il Giardino Tradito, you know, I began to understand that, yeah, maybe De Sica, you know, was a little too concerned about, as Portia said, you know, the international community and the reception of the film. For example, in his criticism, Bassani said, the film actually exists in two different time periods, right? The prologue opens in April of 1957, when Bassani and his friends are traveling to the Roman countryside, and they stop at a necropolis of the Etruscans in Cerveteri. And at one point, the little girl, who is the daughter of his friends, says to the father, "Papa, why is it that ancient tombs are not as sad as new ones?" And the father says, "Well, cara, you know, it's because these people have died a long time ago. They've died so long ago that it's almost as though they never really existed. And so it's like they've almost always been dead." And then there's a pause. And then the little girl says this brilliant, brilliant thing. She goes, "But now, if you say that, you remind me that the Etruscans were also once alive. And so I'm fond of them, like everyone else." And Bassani is struck by this incredible, brilliant insight by this 9-year-old girl. And the whole novel has to be read under that that sign, under that insight. And the film is not seen under that kind of, rubric, unfortunately. The novel ends and begins and ends under the sign of tombs, under the sign of ruin, and it's not exactly the same, I think, in the film. There's too much of a concentration, I think, on the love triangle, which might not have existed. Bassani was incensed that, De Sica made obvious what had been implied. And in the sense, the novel, I wouldn't use the novel either in the Holocaust film. It's just something, I think, too subtle for most of undergraduates to get a handle on.
Thanks so much. I am sure, Ricky, that there are questions in the audience about the future of your opera and when and where it might be performed.
It's premiering next spring, and it's with New York City Opera and the Yiddish Theater. So it'll be in New York City. And then I think there's plans to bring it to Italy, but everything is about when the world opens up again. It was supposed to be last spring, and that was postponed, and so is my opera at the Met, and so is everything's postponed. So hopefully it's going to be all over the world soon, but next spring in New York. Not this coming spring of 2022.
Wonderful. I'm sure we're all looking forward to it. Okay, so we have a few minutes left for the panelists for questions for me, and so I'm going to do a very quick round of what's your favorite what's your favorite scene in the film, and so I think I'll start with Portia. Maybe while Portia tries to unmute herself, I'll start with Francesco.
Oh, my favorite scene is actually the first sequence of the film. This is when the Russian laws are approved and implemented, and Giorgio comes back home with a newspaper, and he has a quarrel with his father, because his father still claims that Italy is better than Germany, and anyway, Mussolini is a great man, and somehow is consistent with the Risorgimento and the unification of Italy, which to which Jews contributed and were, as Stan was pinpointing beforehand. So after this quarrel, the father, and this is the scene I like best, goes into Giorgio's room, and he starts attempting at reestablishing a dialogue with his son. And so he tries to say, well, I understand your stance, understand your position. Nonetheless, you should consider that still we have plenty of freedom. And Giorgio basically proves that his father is wrong, that freedom is being restricted day by day, they're losing rights. And he said, we are just following others in a line which has already persecuted individuals in Italy under fascism. And I like so much this scene because on the one hand, it is a very, I would say, myopic way to convey the fact that freedom is something and democracy is something we need to defend day by day. It is not something which we might take for granted. It is something we need to fight on a daily basis. And secondly,
we're going to move on.
Yeah,
that's great.
The other thing is that the generational conflict, which is something I was hinting at beforehand. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you. Portia.
Well, my favorite scenes are the ones on the bicycles in Ferrara, the young people riding along the streets of Ferrara. It's so Bassani and so Ferrara. If you're going to understand the novel, you need to understand the scenery, and Ferrara is the place. So those are my favorite scenes.
Excellent. Ricky.
There's a moment in the movie that towards the end when the Nazis finally enter the Finzi-Continis home, and it's something only cinema can do, and the light is on a beautiful statue on a table, and it just sort of lets you know that at a certain point that statue is going to be broken, and it's sort of the end of life in that house. It always kills me, that moment.
And Stan.
I have two favorite scenes, one personal, one political. The political one is the scene where Giorgio is ejected from the municipal library by first the guard and then the director of the library, because this, I think, shows the kind of insidious nature of Italian fascism, and it's just as dangerous as, having people with swastikas in the street, these kinds of officials who think, they are carrying out the official policy of fascist Italy. The personal is also a scene between Giorgio and his father, but more personal, where, it's obvious that Giorgio's relationship with Nicole is not going anywhere. And the father says to his son, son, to be wise in the world, you have to die at least once. And if you have to die at least once, it's better to die when you're young.
Thank you. On that note, I'm going to turn things back over to Gia, who's going to moderate the question and answer period.
Hi,
from the
everyone.
audience.
This has been a fascinating discussion. We have some great questions here in the Q&A. Janet asks, this is for Francesco, how was the film received by the Jewish community in 1962? Either Francesco or Stan. Does anyone have an answer?
Dr. Francesco.
Frankly, no, I have no idea. I might explore that, but not on the spot.
Okay.
I don't know myself, so I can't answer.
Jackie, do you happen to know anything about that? No. That was a great question, Janet.
Well, I would say this, it depends. The Jewish community in Italy, is that the question? Well, the Jewish community in Italy in 1970 was much smaller than it was. And if you talk about, a kind of distinct voice, I don't think that there might have been one. But that would be sort of my hunch about it.
Okay. And did the historical circumstances in the film follow the timeline of disenfranchisement and deportation? I ask because the film seems to go from the 1930s and quickly to 1943-44. It's fine for cinematic license, so just curious. Stan, can you unmute?
You're muted.
It's not. Okay. Bassani criticized this, the conflation of the scenes, in the timeline, So very, very quickly, the racial laws were passed in 1938. They were increasingly more severe. Again, in 1940, when Italy declared war, foreign Jews who found themselves in Italy were placed in internment camps, mostly in the South. Until the fall of 1943, no Jews were deported. Someone had asked the question, what happened to the family at the end? Well, it's a fictional account, but many of those people in northern Italy ended up in an internment camp in Carpi near Modena. You can read about this in the first chapter of Primo Levi's book, Sequestro a un Uomo, Survival in Auschwitz. And from there, they were deported to the camps in the north.
Okay, thank you. Let's see. I'm curious about the casting. There's a couple of questions about the casting, and we went over that a little bit. Did anyone have anything else to add about the casting of the lead Jewish characters having non-traditional casting? Anyone else have anything to add about that?
Question for Francesco.
As I said beforehand, I don't believe actually that De Sica wanted to stress solely the Jewish identity of the protagonist, or at least he was much more interested in. And in this respect, I totally agree with Portia or on Giorgio Bassani's perception of De Sica as a superficial man, or a man, or he was a highly talented entertainer. So that was his crucial concern. So I think he was much more interested in having in the main roles actors who were up and coming and were famed at the time than in being truthful or somehow close to historical truth. I think what he was trying to produce was a fascinating, entertaining, and in terms of historical reconstruction, accurate depiction of the times, but not necessarily something which was, I would say, we tend to read the late work of De Sica in the wake of his neorealist work. I don't think we should. I think it was much more on a huge co-production, European or broad co-production schemes, and so the idea of a harsh description of reality was not anymore in his agenda.
Thank you. And we have someone else asking, what is the state of the Jewish community currently in Italy? Fully accepted, or is there still a stigma attached?
Should I answer that? Just
Sure.
very quickly, there is no single Jewish community in Italy. I mean, Italy, just as Ferrara is different from Milan, Milan is different from Naples. Every Jewish community has its own idiosyncrasies. It is true, I would say, well, I used to say it's true that, anti-Semitism is no longer acceptable in Italy, that xenophobia has been transferred to extracomunitari, people from outside the European community. But even that's not true, because you have neo-fascists like the Casa Pound and neo-Nazis in Italy. So even, like the eternal temptation towards anti-Semitism is always there. And the Jewish communities, plural, are different from each other. My friend, who is the only female rabbi in all of Italy, a Reform rabbi, has a very contentious relationship with the official, Orthodox community in Italy, centered in Rome and Milan, which are more conservative.
Thank you. This question is for Portia. Somebody asked if Giorgio ever won any notable tennis tournaments as an amateur player.
Well, yes, he did. As a matter of fact, he was considered second category, which was almost to the top. I mean, almost Olympic level. And even up until he was 75 or 80, he was still winning tournaments at the Parioli Tennis Club here in Rome, where he played practically every day. So he was a winner. He adored playing tennis, and he won all the time.
Thank you. And Mark writes, if I recall, a different ending was devised for the American audience. Is this so? Do you know anything about an alternate?
That's the other way around. The original ending for the American audience was without the slow motion scenes of Alberto and Nicole playing tennis. It was just with, as far as I know, with the remnants of the tennis court, which are paired, whereas the Italian version had Nicole and Alberto in slow motion playing tennis, to my knowledge. So I haven't been collating the two versions, but this is what I know.
Does the Italian Holocaust film in general parallel reflect Italian Holocaust memory?
This is a very good question, Mary, but Stan, please, you need to unmute yourself.
No, first you, Francesco.
Well, I think so. I think that, as we know, in the memory of the Holocaust in Italy, as in other places, got started quite late compared to the actual events. And I think that possibly not as much as for Germany with the broadcasting of Holocaust, the series, but also in Italy, that the memory was triggered quite late compared to the events and the involvement of the administration in causing the events themselves.
I think this might be part of a larger question of the memory of fascism in Italy and how that's been suppressed, literally like shut up in what was called the armadio della vergogna, the closet of shame. Like, unlike Germany, The Italians never really came to grips with their responsibility. And like I said, there's the cultivation of this myth after the war, Italiani brava gente, most Italians survived. We were not like the Nazis. We helped the Jews. The Vatican helped people. Now, if you read Italian memoirs, Italian Jewish memoirs, it is true that like a lot of Italian Christians helped, Jews survive. But that doesn't exonerate, the institutions of the police, the military, the Vatican, education, all of whom are implicated in the film and in the novel very well. But the Italians, they like to remember history in a different way.
I'm going to pass it back to Jackie right now. And Jackie, do you have any other questions?
Yeah, I think there was a little bit of chatter in the chat about the music, and I thought maybe Ricky, could you talk a little bit about the musical choices in the film, and what they might say, and their effect.
Do you mean the musical choices in the opera or in the film?
No, in the film, in the soundtrack.
I have to say, I think it's a beautiful movie score. I mean, I think it's beautiful. It's it has the instrumentation at certain points is right out of the 70s, and it sort of anchors you there. But I think it's a very stirring, beautiful, melodic score. I mean, it was partially what was inspiring to me with the movie. I thought of something that the way the whole ending of the movie, right, is different from the book. But there are things like that, the scene with the grandmother, and that just, I don't know, I had to attach myself to them because the idea, it's a very emotional opera. I mean, I was thinking about with what Stan was saying, that scene with the father, I was like, we have to do something major there. And the father has an aria called Let Yourself Die. The racial laws is a huge sequence called The Law is the Law, and it shows the racial laws being exhibited everywhere, in the home, in the library, in the workplace, at the bank. But as far as the score for the movie, I mean, I don't feel really any prejudice about the movie. The movie brought me to the book and the story, and I'm glad to enjoy both.
On that note, I'm going to wrap up the panel. I want to thank our panelists for an incredibly insightful and lively discussion. And I want to thank the audience for joining us today, and the museum for hosting this great event. So I wish you all a great day. Please be safe and please be well. And may we all see each other at Ricky's Opera next spring.
Yes, it's so nice to meet you all.